3 weeks passed after the awakening of the Dragon Armada. Kyle stood in the hangar bay of Sanctuary Station and watched technicians work on his new dragon ship. The vessel was smaller than the World Heart but still impressive at nearly 200 meters long. Its scales gleamed silver and blue in the station lights. The dragon ship had told Kyle its name during their bonding. It called itself Starfire and claimed to have flown with the first Starsinger warriors thousands of years ago. Now it had chosen Kyle as its new rider, and together they would write new stories in the stars. Lyra walked up beside him with Ember trotting at her heels. The young dragon had grown significantly over the past weeks and now measured 5 meters from nose to tail. His scales had healed completely and shone like polished rubies. He was becoming the magnificent creature he was always meant to be. Lyra looked tired despite getting plenty of rest. The burden of leadership weighed heavily on her young shoulders. She was now the queen of the elven people and had to make decisions that would affect millions of lives. General Chen and his officers advised her, but the final choices were always hers to make. She asked Kyle if he was ready for the mission that lay ahead. Intelligence reports indicated that Admiral Brooks had retreated to a hidden fortress in the Veil Nebula. From there, she was coordinating with Dominion forces to plan a counterattack against the Dragon Armada. The resistance needed to strike first before Brooks could gather enough strength to threaten them again. Kyle confirmed he was ready. He had spent the last 3 weeks training with Starfire and learning how to merge his consciousness with the dragon ship. It was unlike anything he had experienced before. When he flew Starfire, he could feel the ship thoughts and emotions as clearly as his own. They were two beings becoming one for the duration of flight. Rebecca joined them and reported that the strike force was assembled and waiting for final orders. She would command a squadron of resistance fighters while Kyle led the Dragon Riders. Lyra would remain at Sanctuary Station where she would be safe from enemy attack. Lyra protested this arrangement. She wanted to go with them and face Admiral Brooks directly. The woman had betrayed humanity and caused the deaths of countless elves. Justice demanded that the last Starsinger be present when Brooks was finally brought to account. General Chen argued against allowing Lyra to join the mission. She was too valuable to risk in combat. If something happened to her, the entire elven civilization would lose its rightful leader. But Lyra refused to hide while others fought in her name. She had already lost too much and would not lose her courage now. Kyle understood how she felt. Sometimes you had to face your enemies directly, no matter the risk. He supported her decision to join the strike force, despite knowing it made the mission much more dangerous. Ember seemed pleased that his rider would be coming along. The dragon radiated confidence and eagerness for battle. The strike force launched from Sanctuary Station in a coordinated wave. 20 resistance fighters led by Rebecca flew in tight formation. Behind them came 5 dragon ships, including Starfire, with Kyle at the helm. Lyra rode in a small transport escorted by Ember, who had grown large enough to fly escort duty. They traveled through hyperspace for 6 hours before reaching the Veil Nebula. The region was filled with clouds of gas and dust that played havoc with sensors and communication systems. It was the perfect place to hide a secret base. Brooks had chosen her fortress location well. Kyle merged fully with Starfire as they entered the nebula. Through the dragon ship-enhanced senses, he could perceive things that normal scanners would miss. He detected the fortress hidden deep within the densest part of the gas cloud. It was a massive station armed with enough weapons to destroy a small fleet. But Kyle also sensed something else. Dominion warships were gathering around the fortress in large numbers. Admiral Brooks had not been idle during her retreat. She had called in reinforcements from her alien allies and now commanded a force that outnumbered the strike team by at least 5-1. Rebecca received the same information from her scouts and immediately called for reinforcements from Sanctuary Station. But help was hours away and the strike force was already committed. They had 2 choices: retreat and abandon the mission or press forward despite the terrible odds. Lyra made the decision for all of them. She ordered the attack to proceed. Too many people had died because of Brooks' betrayal. The killing had to stop here and now, even if it meant sacrificing everything they had gained. The battle began with Rebecca fighters engaging the Dominion patrol ships around the fortress perimeter. Laser fire and missiles streaked through the nebula gas, creating brilliant flashes of light. The resistance pilots fought with skill and determination, but they were quickly overwhelmed by superior numbers. Kyle led the dragon ships in a diving attack that caught the enemy by surprise. Starfire unleashed streams of white fire that melted through enemy hulls like butter. The other dragon riders followed his lead, and together they carved a path through the Dominion formation toward the fortress itself. Admiral Brooks watched the battle from her command center and recognized the dragon ship signatures. She knew that Kyle had bonded with one of the awakened vessels. Her face twisted with anger as she realized her former subordinate had become one of her greatest enemies. She ordered all fortress weapons to concentrate fire on the dragon ships. Hundreds of cannons opened up simultaneously, and the space around Kyle exploded with incoming fire. Starfire dodged and weaved with impossible agility, but even a dragon ship could only take so much damage. Kyle felt starfire pain as energy beams scored its armored hide. The ship was tough and could regenerate, but the damage was accumulating faster than it could heal. They needed to end this battle quickly or they would all be destroyed. Lyra saw what was happening and made a choice that would change everything. She ordered Ember to fly toward the fortress at maximum speed. Her transport followed close behind, weaving through the storm of weapons fire. She had a plan, but it required her to get inside the fortress itself. Rebecca screamed into the communicator for Lyra to turn back. The young queen was flying straight into certain death. But Lyra ignored her and continued forward with Ember clearing a path through enemy fighters. Nothing was going to stop her from confronting Admiral Brooks face to face. Kyle realized what Lyra intended to do. She was going to board the fortress and force Brooks to surrender by threatening to destroy the station from within. It was insane and reckless and incredibly brave. He ordered Starfire to follow Lyra and provide cover fire. Ember reached the fortress hull and used his claws to tear open an emergency airlock. Lyra transport docked quickly and she rushed inside with a small team of resistance soldiers. Ember could not fit through the airlock, so he remained outside breathing fire at any ship that tried to approach. Inside the fortress, Lyra moved through corridors with practiced efficiency. She had studied the station layout during the journey here and knew exactly where to find the command center. Guards tried to stop her, but the resistance soldiers held them off while she kept moving forward. She burst into the command center and found Admiral Brooks standing before a tactical display. The two women stared at each other across the room. Brooks looked older than Lyra remembered from intelligence photos. Stress and guilt had carved lines into her face. Brooks asked Lyra why she had come here when she could have stayed safe at Sanctuary Station. Lyra replied that she came to ask Brooks a simple question. Why had the Admiral betrayed her own people and allied with monsters who committed genocide? Brooks' face hardened and she explained her reasoning. She claimed she did what was necessary to save humanity from extinction. The Dominion was too powerful to defeat through conventional warfare. By sacrificing the elves, she had bought humanity time to prepare better defenses and develop new weapons. Lyra felt rage burning in her chest, but she kept her voice calm. She told Brooks that she understood fear and the desire to protect your people, but there were lines that should never be crossed no matter the circumstances. Brooks had sold her soul for a security that was always an illusion. The Dominion would never honor their agreements once they had conquered all their enemies. Brooks seemed to waver as if Lyra's words had struck something deep inside her. For a moment, her mask of certainty cracked and Kyle could see the doubt underneath. But then Brooks shook her head and reached for a weapon on her belt. The choice was made in an instant. Kyle had followed Lyra into the command center and now stood between her and Brooks. He raised his own weapon and fired before Brooks could. The shot hit the Admiral in the chest and she fell backward with a look of surprise on her face. Lyra rushed forward and knelt beside the dying woman. She asked Brooks if she had any regrets about what she had done. Brooks coughed blood and whispered that she regretted nothing. She had done her duty as she understood it. Then her eyes went blank and she died. Kyle felt no satisfaction from the kill, only a profound sadness. Admiral Brooks had been a good officer once before fear and pride had corrupted her judgment. She had made terrible choices, but she had done so believing she was saving lives. In the end, she was just another casualty of a war that had already claimed too many victims. Lyra stood and addressed the fortress crew over the Resistance fleet dropped out of hyperspace in a system that human charts labeled as barren and worthless. Kyle looked out the viewport and saw nothing but empty space dotted with a few small planets. But Lyra stood beside him and pointed to a region where starlight seemed to bend oddly. She explained that the dragon ships were hidden behind a perception field that made them invisible to normal sensors. Only someone with Starsinger blood could see through the illusion and navigate to the actual location. Lyra closed her eyes and placed her hand against the viewport. Ember stood behind her with his head raised high. Slowly, the illusion began to fade like fog burning away in sunlight. What emerged from the haze took Kyle's breath away. Massive shapes floated in the void, each one larger than any human battleship. There were dozens of them arranged in formations that suggested purpose and intelligence. The dragon ships were beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Their hulls looked like they were made from living metal that flowed and shifted even while dormant. Wings stretched from their sides not for flight but as solar collectors that fed power to their sleeping systems. At the front of each ship was a head with closed eyes and a mouth filled with what looked like cannon ports. General Chen's voice came over the communication system. He ordered the fleet to take defensive positions around the Dragon Armada. Scouts reported that Admiral Brooks' forces had detected their arrival and were already jumping into the system. The battle would begin within minutes. Kyle helped Lyra prepare for the awakening ritual. She wore ceremonial robes that Rebecca had helped her put on. The fabric was woven with silver thread that caught the light in beautiful patterns. In her hand she carried the artifact that her parents had given her before they died. The artifact was a crystal sphere about the size of a grapefruit. Inside it swirled colors that had no names in human language. Lyra explained that it contained the genetic memories of every starsinger who had ever lived. When she activated it during the ritual, those memories would call out to the sleeping dragons and remind them of their purpose. Rebecca escorted them to a small shuttle that would take them to the largest dragon ship. That vessel was called the World Heart, and it served as the queen of the entire armada. If Lyra could awaken the World Heart, then all the other ships would follow. Kyle piloted the shuttle across the empty space between the fleet and the dragon ships. Behind them, he could see the resistance vessels spreading out into battle formation. Ahead, the World Heart grew larger until it filled his entire view. The ship was so massive that it created its own gravitational field. They found a docking port on the side of the World Heart, and Kyle carefully maneuvered the shuttle into position. The port opened automatically as if the ship recognized Lyra's presence. They docked with a gentle thump and the airlock cycled to allow them entry. The interior of the World Heart was like nothing Kyle had ever seen. Corridors stretched in organic curves that resembled the inside of a living creature, more than a spacecraft. Walls pulsed with faint bioluminescence that provided enough light to see by. The air smelled of cinnamon and ozone. Lyra led them deeper into the ship, following a path that only she could sense. Ember walked beside her with his head moving back and forth as if searching for threats. Rebecca and Kyle brought up the rear with weapons ready, despite knowing they could do little against anything that lived inside this ancient vessel. They reached a chamber at the heart of the ship. The room was spherical with walkways spiraling up from a platform at the center. Above them, a crystal structure hung suspended in midair, pulsing with dim light. Lyra said this was the core where the World Heart consciousness resided. She walked out onto the central platform and placed the artifact on a pedestal that rose from the floor. Amber moved to stand beside her and spread his wings as far as the space allowed. Together they began the ritual that would awaken the sleeping dragons. Lyra sang in her native language. The words were ancient and filled with power that Kyle could feel vibrating in his bones. The artifact began to glow brighter, and tendrils of light reached up toward the crystal core above. Ember joined his voice to hers, creating a harmony that resonated through the entire ship. Kyle felt the World Heart responding. The walls began to pulse faster and the bioluminescence grew brighter. A deep thrumming sound filled the air like a giant heartbeat. The ship was waking up after centuries of sleep, and the sensation was both wonderful and terrifying. Rebecca communicator crackled with urgent messages from the fleet. Admiral Brooks' forces had arrived in overwhelming numbers. Dozens of warships and hundreds of fighters poured into the system. The resistance fleet was badly outnumbered and already taking heavy losses. Kyle wanted to help his comrades, but he knew his place was here protecting Lyra. The ritual was only halfway complete, and interrupting it now would mean failure. He gripped his weapon tighter and watched the entrance to the chamber, while praying the fleet could hold out long enough. The battle outside reached a crescendo. Laser fire and missiles filled the space between the opposing forces. Resistance ships fought with desperate courage, but Admiral Brooks' vessels were better armed and better trained. One by one, the resistance ships were being destroyed or disabled. General Chen ordered a fighting retreat to draw the enemy away from the Dragon Armada. He knew that sacrificing his fleet was meaningless if Lyra could complete the ritual. His ship took a direct hit and began venting atmosphere, but he stayed at his post directing the defense until the very end. Inside the World Heart, the ritual continued. Lyra's voice grew stronger and the artifact blazed like a small star. The crystal core above them erupted with light that filled the entire chamber. Ember roared and flames shot from his mouth to merge with the energy pouring from the artifact. The World Heart consciousness awakened fully. Kyle felt its presence touch his mind like gentle fingers exploring unfamiliar territory. The dragon ship was curious about these small creatures who had entered its body. It sensed Lyra Starsinger blood and recognized her as one who had the right to command. Lyra made her request. She asked the World Heart to awaken the Armada and help them fight against the Dominion. She explained what had happened to the elven civilization and why the dragons were needed now more than ever. The World Heart considered her words with ancient wisdom. Finally, the great dragon ship made its decision. It would wake its siblings, and together they would join the battle. But it demanded something in return. The dragons would not be weapons of war controlled by any government or military force. They would choose their own riders and fight according to their own sense of honor and justice. Lyra agreed to these terms without hesitation. She had never intended to control the dragons, only to ask for their help. The World Heart was satisfied with her answer. It sent out a telepathic call that rippled across space and reached every sleeping dragon ship. One by one, the Armada began to stir. Eyes opened along the hulls of the massive vessels and glowed with golden light. Wings unfolded and stretched after their long rest. The dragon ships came alive, and their presence filled the system with power that made even the stars seem dim by comparison. Admiral Brooks' forces faltered when they saw what was happening. The enemy had expected to face a resistance fleet, not an entire armada of living warships. Brooks ordered her vessels to focus fire on the awakening dragons before they could become fully active. The World Heart rose to meet this challenge. It moved with grace that belied its enormous size and positioned itself between the enemy fleet and its awakening siblings. Energy gathered in its mouth, and it unleashed a beam of white fire that vaporized 3 enemy cruisers in a single blast. The other dragon ships joined the battle as soon as they were fully awake. They moved through space like they were swimming through water. Their weapons were devastating, and their armor regenerated damage almost as fast as it was inflicted. The tide of battle shifted dramatically in favor of the resistance. Kyle watched through the viewport as the dragons tore through Admiral Brooks' fleet. It was both beautiful and terrible to witness. These ancient beings had been built for war, and they remembered their purpose well. They fought with coordination that spoke of shared consciousness and strategies that humans could barely comprehend. Admiral Brooks realized too late that she had made a terrible mistake. Her alliance with the Dominion had seemed practical when the elves were weak and scattered. But now she faced the full might of the Dragon Armada, and her forces were no match for them. She ordered a retreat, but the dragons pursued relentlessly. The World Heart broadcast a message to all ships in the system, both ally and enemy. Its voice was like thunder rolling across the stars. It declared that the time of persecution was over. The elven people would be protected, and any who threatened them would face the wrath of the Dragon Armada. Some of Admiral Brooks' captains chose to surrender, rather than continue fighting a battle they could not win. Others tried to escape but found their hyperspace drives disabled by some power the dragons possessed. Only a handful of ships managed to jump away, including Brooks' flagship. The battle ended in a decisive victory for the Resistance. General Chen fleet had been saved from destruction, and the Dragon Armada was fully awake. Lyra collapsed from exhaustion after completing the ritual. Kyle caught her before the stolen shuttle drifted through empty space while Kyle studied the star charts on his display. They had enough fuel for maybe 2 more jumps before they would be stranded. Food and water would last 3 days at most. He needed to find help soon, or they would all die out here in the void. Lyra sat behind him with Ember curled in her lap. The dragon was doing better after the treatment Kyle had provided, but he still needed proper medical care. His burns were healing slowly, and his breathing had improved, but infection remained a serious risk. Kyle traced possible routes with his finger on the screen. Most of the nearby systems were controlled by either the Dominion or Earth military forces loyal to Admiral Brooks. Going to any of those places would mean capture or death. He needed to find a resistance outpost, but their locations were kept secret for obvious reasons. A signal suddenly appeared on his scanner. Kyle tensed and checked the source. It was a hailing frequency from an unknown vessel that had just dropped out of hyperspace nearby. The ship was small like a patrol craft, but its design was not standard military issue. Kyle debated whether to respond or try to run. His shuttle was too slow and too damaged to outrun a proper warship. If this was an enemy, then they were already caught. He decided to answer the hail and hope for the best. The view screen activated and showed the face of a woman with short dark hair and hard eyes. She wore a military uniform, but the insignia had been removed from her collar. She studied Kyle for a moment before speaking. She introduced herself as Commander Rebecca Stone and asked what Kyle was doing out here in a stolen shuttle. Her tone was neutral, but Kyle detected suspicion in her expression. He had to decide quickly whether to tell her the truth or try to maintain his cover story. Something about Rebecca made Kyle trust her. Maybe it was the way she watched him with intelligence rather than hostility. He took a chance and told her everything. He explained about finding Lyra in the ruins and learning her true identity. He described Admiral Brooks hunting them and their desperate escape from the transport ship. Rebecca listened without interrupting. When Kyle finished, she sat back in her chair and seemed to consider his story carefully. Then she asked a question that caught him off guard. She wanted to know if he was aware that Admiral Brooks had been selling military intelligence to the Dominion. Kyle felt shock ripple through him. He had suspected that something was wrong with the way Brooks handled the war, but he never imagined outright treason. Rebecca explained that she had been Brooks' second-in-command until recently, when she discovered evidence of the betrayal. Brooks had been providing the Dominion with coordinates for elven settlements and defensive positions. In exchange, the Dominion gave Earth access to advanced technology and promised not to attack human colonies. The Admiral justified this arrangement by claiming it would save human lives, even if it meant sacrificing the elves. Rebecca had confronted Brooks about the evidence and barely escaped with her life. She had been branded a traitor and was now hunted by both Earth military and Dominion forces. She had joined up with the resistance and was now trying to warn others about what Brooks was doing. Kyle asked if Rebecca could help them reach the resistance headquarters. He explained that Lyra might be the key to turning the tide of the war if they could keep her alive long enough. Rebecca agreed to escort them but warned that the journey would be dangerous. They transferred to Rebecca's shuttle, which was larger and better armed than Kyle's stolen craft. Lyra and Ember came aboard carefully while Rebecca's crew watched with wide eyes. Not many humans had seen an elf and dragon up close before. The journey to Sanctuary Station took 2 days of careful travel through contested space. They avoided patrol routes and used debris fields to mask their energy signature whenever possible. Rebecca explained that Sanctuary was a hidden station built inside a hollowed asteroid, in a system that most people considered worthless. During the journey, Kyle learned more about Rebecca's past. She had lost her daughter in a Dominion raid 3 years ago. Her daughter had been only 8 years old when she died. Ever since then, Rebecca had dedicated herself to fighting the Dominion, but she refused to compromise her principles like Brooks had done. Looking at Lyra reminded Rebecca of her daughter. Both girls had the same fierce determination in their eyes. Rebecca promised Kyle that she would do everything in her power to protect the young elf and help her awaken the Dragon Armada. On the second day of travel, they detected another ship following them. Rebecca tried to lose it, but the pursuer was fast and persistent. Eventually, they had no choice but to prepare for combat. Kyle took a gunner position while Rebecca piloted. The enemy ship closed the distance and opened fire. Laser beams streaked through space and impacted their shields. Rebecca returned fire while performing evasive maneuvers. The battle was intense and both ships took damage during the exchange. Lyra suddenly stood up and walked to the cargo hold despite Kyle shouting for her to stay safe. She opened the rear hatch and Ember leaped out into the vacuum of space. The dragon had grown larger over the past 2 days and now measured nearly 3 meters from nose to tail. What happened next amazed everyone on board. Ember flew through space like he was made for it. His scales began to glow with intense heat and flames gathered in his throat. He shot toward the enemy ship with incredible speed and unleashed a blast of white fire that cut through their hull like it was paper. The enemy ship exploded in a ball of flame and debris. Ember circled back to their shuttle and squeezed through the cargo hatch. Once inside, he shook himself and small embers fell from his scales. He looked pleased with himself despite being exhausted from the effort. Lyra rushed to her companion and checked him for injuries. Ember nuzzled her gently and made a sound like a cat purring. Kyle and Rebecca exchanged stunned looks. They had just witnessed something that should have been impossible according to human understanding of physics. Rebecca asked Lyra how Ember could survive and breathe fire in the vacuum of space. Lyra explained that dragons were not purely biological creatures. They were part flesh and part something else that humans did not have words for. They could exist anywhere their riders needed them to be. The revelation made Kyle realize just how powerful the Dragon Armada must be if every ship was alive like Ember. No wonder the Dominion wanted to prevent them from awakening. An entire fleet of ships that could regenerate damage and adapt to any environment would be nearly unstoppable. They reached Sanctuary Station without further incident. The asteroid looked like any other rock floating in space, but Rebecca transmitted a code, and hidden doors opened to reveal a massive hangar inside. Dozens of ships filled the bay, along with hundreds of people working on repairs and preparations. Rebecca led them through the station to the command center, where they met General Marcus Chen. The general was an older man with gray hair and scars on his face from many battles. Beside him stood Lieutenant Amy Foster, who served as his tactical officer. Kyle explained everything to the general while Lyra stood quietly with Ember at her side. General Chen listened carefully and asked several pointed questions about the Dragon Armada. He wanted to know how long it would take to awaken the ships, and whether they could be controlled once active. Lyra answered honestly. She said the awakening ritual would take several hours to complete and required her to be at the location of the sleeping ships. Once awakened, the dragons would bond with new riders, but only those who proved themselves worthy. They could not be forced to serve anyone. General Chen considered this information and then made his decision. He would commit the resistance fleet to protecting Lyra while she performed the ritual. The risk was enormous because Admiral Brooks would throw everything she had at them to prevent the awakening. But the potential reward was worth it. Plans were made quickly. The resistance would launch a coordinated attack to draw away enemy forces while a small team escorted Lyra to the Dragon Fleet location. Kyle volunteered to be part of that escort team along with Rebecca. Lyra prepared for the mission by meditating with Ember. The dragon had grown even larger over the past few hours and now barely fit in the quarters they had been given. His scales shimmered with inner light and his eyes glowed like golden stars. Kyle checked his weapons and armor one last time. He knew this mission would likely be his last one way or another. If they succeeded, then the war might finally turn in favor of those fighting against the Dominion. If they failed, then everything would be lost. Rebecca found him in the armory and they talked quietly about what was coming. She thanked him for giving her a chance to make a difference. Her daughter Death had left a hole in her heart that nothing could fill, but helping Lyra gave her purpose again. Kyle understood exactly what she meant. He had lost friends and comrades to this war and carried guilt for surviving when they had not. Protecting Lyra felt like a way to honor their sacrifice and give meaning to all the suffering they had endured. The fleet prepared to launch. Every ship was crewed and armed to the best of their ability. General Chen gave a speech over the communication system and reminded everyone what they were fighting for. They were not just fighting to survive, but to prove that honor and courage still mattered in a universe that seemed determined to crush both. Kyle stood beside Lyra. The transport ship hummed with activity as Kyle led Lyra and Ember through the narrow corridors. He had managed to get them aboard by claiming they were injured colonists who needed medical attention. The crew was too busy preparing for departure to ask many questions, but Kyle knew that would change soon. He found an empty storage compartment near the engineering section and helped Lyra inside. The space was small and cramped, but it had the advantage of being away from the main crew areas. Supplies lined the walls and created natural hiding spots between the containers. Lyra set Ember down carefully on a blanket Kyle had found. The dragon was weaker than before and his breathing had become more labored. His scales had lost some of their shine and the burns on his body looked infected. Without proper treatment, he might not survive the journey to the fleet. Kyle told Lyra to stay hidden while he went to find medical supplies. She nodded but grabbed his arm before he could leave. Her purple eyes searched his face as if trying to read his intentions. Then she spoke slowly, using simple words that her translator could handle easily. She told him that she needed to explain something important about who she was and why the Dominion wanted her dead. Kyle sat down on a supply crate and listened as she revealed a truth that would change everything he thought he knew about this war. Lyra was not just a refugee from a destroyed settlement. She was the last surviving member of the Elven royal family. Her full name was Lyra Starsinger, and she carried the bloodline of the ancient dragon kings. Ember was not simply her pet, but a sacred guardian dragon bonded to her family for generations. The Elven civilization had once controlled a vast region of space through their alliance with the dragons. These creatures were not just animals, but highly intelligent beings who shared a telepathic connection with their chosen riders. Together they had built ships and stations that dwarfed anything humans had created. But the Dominion had learned about a secret that the elves had kept hidden for centuries. Deep in Elven space there existed a fleet of enormous dragon ships that had been placed in hibernation long ago. These vessels were alive in a way that normal ships were not. They could regenerate damage and grow stronger over time. The key to awakening these ships was carried in the genetic code of the Starsinger bloodline. Only someone with royal blood could perform the ritual that would bring the dragon armada back to life. The Dominion had attacked the elven worlds not for territory or resources, but to eliminate anyone who could awaken those ancient weapons. Lyra explained that she had survived only because her parents had hidden her on New Portland Colony. They had sent her away with Ember and the sacred artifact needed for the awakening ritual. Both of her parents had died defending the elven homeworld while she escaped. Kyle struggled to process what he was hearing. If Lyra was telling the truth, then she represented the last hope for the entire elven race. She was also a massive threat to the Dominion, which meant they would hunt her relentlessly once they discovered she still lived. He asked her why she had offered him that coin back in the ruins. What did she really want from him in exchange for such a small amount of money? Lyra smiled sadly and explained that it was a test. She needed to know if there were still people in the universe who would help others without expecting great rewards. Her parents had told her that humans could be trusted if you found the right ones. They said humans valued courage and loyalty above most other things. By offering Kyle something small, she was giving him a choice. He could have taken the coin and left her to die, or he could choose to help her for reasons that had nothing to do with payment. Kyle felt the weight of her words settle over him. He had made his choice back in those ruins without fully understanding what it meant. Now he was committed to protecting this girl and her dragon no matter the cost. He asked Lyra what she planned to do next. Where could she go that the Dominion would not find her? She told him that she needed to reach the human resistance forces. She had heard rumors that some human officers disagreed with the way Earth government was handling the war. These resistance fighters might be willing to help her if she could reach them. But first, they had to survive the journey to the main fleet. Kyle left the storage compartment and went to find medical supplies for Ember. He moved through the ship trying to look casual, while his mind raced with plans and possibilities. In the medical bay, he gathered bandages and burn ointment along with some pain medication. The medic on duty asked what he needed the supplies for, and Kyle made up a story about treating some minor injuries. The medic seemed suspicious but handed over the items without further questions. On his way back to the storage compartment, Kyle passed by a group of officers talking in low voices. He slowed his pace and pretended to check his datapad while listening to their conversation. What he heard made his blood run cold. The officers were discussing orders they had received from Admiral Catherine Brooks. The Admiral had issued instructions to search the ship for unauthorized passengers. Apparently, someone had reported seeing an elven child being brought aboard the transport. Admiral Brooks wanted that child found and detained immediately. Kyle felt panic rise in his chest but forced it down. He had to get back to Lyra and warn her before the search began. He walked quickly through the corridors and tried to avoid drawing attention to himself. When he reached the storage compartment, he found Lyra exactly where he had left her. She was singing softly to Ember in her native language. The song was beautiful and haunting, and it made the dragon purr with contentment despite his injuries. Kyle interrupted her and explained what he had overheard. They had very little time before security teams started searching the ship. They needed to find a better hiding place or a way to get off this vessel before it docked with the main fleet. Lyra looked frightened but determined. She told Kyle that Ember could sense the emotions of people nearby through their telepathic bond. If they were careful, they might be able to avoid the security teams by sensing which corridors were clear and which ones to avoid. Kyle was skeptical, but he had no better plan. He helped Lyra apply the medical supplies to Ember while they prepared to move. The dragon seemed stronger after being treated, and he lifted his head with more alertness than before. They gathered their few belongings and left the storage compartment. Lyra held Ember close and closed her eyes while concentrating on the feelings she received from him. She pointed down a corridor to the left and whispered that it felt safe in that direction. Kyle trusted her and led the way. They moved through the ship like ghosts, staying in shadows and avoiding crew members whenever possible. Several times Lyra warned Kyle that security was approaching, and they hid in maintenance closets until the danger passed. The escape was working until they reached a junction near the cargo bays. A security officer rounded the corner and came face to face with them. The officer reached for his communicator, but Kyle was faster. He stunned the man with his sidearm before he could call for help. Now they had even less time than before. Once that officer was discovered missing, the entire ship would go into lockdown. Kyle and Lyra ran toward the cargo bay, hoping to find some way off the transport before it was too late. In the bay, they found supply shuttles being loaded with equipment. Kyle spotted one that looked ready for departure and made a decision. They would steal the shuttle and escape before the alarm was raised. He helped Lyra climb into the small craft and took the pilot seat. The controls were standard military issue, and he knew how to fly them well. He started the engines and requested departure clearance from the bay controller. The controller granted clearance without suspicion. The shuttle lifted off from the deck and moved toward the open bay doors. Kyle kept his speed steady and tried to look like he was just doing routine supply runs. They were almost clear of the transport when the alarm finally sounded. Red lights flashed throughout the bay, and the controller ordered Kyle to return immediately. Instead, he pushed the throttles forward and shot out into open space. Laser fire streaked past their shuttle as the transport tried to stop their escape. Kyle dodged and weaved while pushing the small craft to its maximum speed. Behind them, he could see other shuttles launching in pursuit. Lyra held Ember tightly and whispered encouragement to him. The dragon seemed to understand the danger they were in. His eyes glowed brighter and smoke puffed from his nostrils with each breath. Kyle set a course for deep space and hoped they could lose their pursuers in the asteroid field ahead. The shuttle rattled and shook as he pushed it beyond safe limits. Warning lights flashed on his control panel, but he ignored them. They plunged into the asteroid field, and Kyle used every bit of his piloting skill to navigate through the floating rocks. Several times they came within meters of collision but somehow managed to avoid disaster. The pursuing shuttles were not as lucky, and 2 of them crashed into asteroids before giving up the chase. Finally, they emerged on the far side of the field and found empty space ahead of them. Kyle checked his scanner and saw no signs of pursuit. They had escaped, but now they were alone in hostile territory with limited fuel and supplies. Lyra looked at him with gratitude and relief. She knew he had just sacrificed his career and possibly his freedom to save her and Ember. Kyle met her gaze, and the smoke filled the air like thick fog as Lieutenant Kyle Morrison walked through the ruins of New Portland Colony. Buildings lay crushed and broken around him. Fire burned in scattered piles of debris. His boots crunched on broken glass and metal with each step he took across the destroyed street. Kyle had seen many battlefields in his 3 years of service, but this one felt different somehow. The Dominion forces had left nothing standing when they attacked this place. Every home was shattered and every vehicle was melted slag. The enemy had wanted to send a message with this destruction. He checked his scanner again and saw no life signs in the area. Command had ordered him to do one final sweep before the evacuation ships left orbit. Soon this entire colony would be abandoned to the void of space and forgotten like so many other lost worlds. A sound caught his attention from somewhere to his left. Kyle froze and listened carefully while his hand moved to his weapon. The sound came again, and this time he recognized it as a whimper or cry. Someone was still alive in this wasteland. He moved quickly toward the noise and found himself standing before a collapsed building. Half of the structure still stood while the other half had been reduced to rubble. The crying sound came from within the wreckage. Kyle climbed over broken concrete and twisted metal beams. His armor protected him from the sharp edges as he squeezed through a narrow gap. The space opened into what had once been a storage room. Light filtered through cracks in the walls and ceiling above. 2 figures huddled in the corner of the room surrounded by shadows. Kyle activated his helmet light and the beam revealed something he had never expected to see. A young girl with pointed ears and silver hair sat on the ground. Her clothes were torn and covered in dust. Beside her lay a creature that looked like a small dragon with scales that gleamed red and gold even through the dirt. The girl looked up at Kyle with wide, purple eyes that reflected his light like mirrors. She did not run or scream. Instead, she slowly stood and held something out toward him in her small hand. Kyle stepped closer and saw it was a crystalline coin that caught the light and split it into rainbow colors. The girl spoke in a language Kyle did not understand. Her voice was soft and gentle despite the terror she must have felt. She kept holding the coin toward him as if offering payment for something. Kyle knelt down slowly so he would seem less threatening to her. His translator device worked on the language for several seconds before words began to form in his earpiece. The translation was rough, but he could understand the basic meaning. The girl was asking him to do something, but not to save her life. She wanted him to remember her people and tell others their story. Kyle looked at the small dragon beside her and saw it was badly injured. Burns covered its body and one wing hung at an odd angle. The creature breathed in shallow gasps that produced small puffs of smoke. It would not survive much longer without medical help. The girl saw where Kyle was looking and tears began to stream down her cheeks. She spoke again, and this time the translator caught more of her words. She said her name was Lyra, and the dragon was called Ember. They were the last survivors from an attack that had destroyed her entire settlement. Kyle felt something twist inside his chest as he listened to her story. This girl could not have been more than 12 or 13 years old. She had watched her family and friends die, and yet she stood here offering him money to remember them. The weight of that request settled on his shoulders like a heavy burden. He reached out and gently closed her hand around the coin. Then he tapped his chest plate and said his name slowly so she could hear it. Kyle pointed to the exit and made a gesture that indicated they should leave together. He would not abandon this child and her dragon to die alone in the ruins. Lyra seemed to understand what he meant. She nodded and carefully lifted Ember into her arms. The dragon was small enough that she could carry him, but Kyle could see the effort it took. He offered to take the creature, but Lyra shook her head firmly. The bond between them was clearly very strong. They made their way back through the rubble with Kyle leading the path. He had to move slowly because Lyra struggled with the weight of her injured companion. Several times they had to stop so she could rest and adjust her grip on Ember. When they emerged into the open air, Kyle checked his scanner again. The evacuation ships would be leaving orbit in less than 2 hours. He needed to get Lyra and Ember onto one of those vessels before they departed. The problem was that Command had strict protocols about unauthorized passengers. Kyle made a decision that could end his military career. He activated his communicator and reported that he had found survivors who needed immediate medical evacuation. He did not mention that the survivors were not human. That detail could wait until they were safely aboard a ship. The response came back quickly. A transport shuttle would land at his coordinates in 30 minutes to pick them up. Kyle acknowledged the message and then helped Lyra find a sheltered spot where they could wait. She sat down with Ember still cradled in her arms and looked up at Kyle with an expression of gratitude mixed with sorrow. While they waited, Kyle studied the girl and her dragon more carefully. He had heard stories about the elven race and their dragon riders, but had never seen them in person. The Dominion had been hunting them across the galaxy for reasons that remained unclear to most humans. Some said the elves possessed technology that the Dominion wanted to steal. Others claimed it was simply genocide for the sake of conquest. Looking at Lyra now, Kyle understood why the Dominion might fear these people. Despite her young age and desperate situation, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that spoke of inner strength. Her people must have been formidable before the war destroyed them. Ember stirred in her arms and opened his eyes. They glowed with a faint golden light that seemed almost intelligent. The dragon looked directly at Kyle and made a sound like a purr mixed with a growl. Lyra whispered something to her companion and stroked his scales gently. The shuttle arrived exactly on time and landed in a clear area nearby. Kyle helped Lyra to her feet, and they walked toward the vessel together. The pilot opened the rear hatch and stared in shock when he saw what Kyle was bringing aboard. Kyle gave the pilot a hard look and shook his head once. The message was clear, and the pilot wisely kept his mouth shut. He gestured for them to get inside quickly. Kyle helped Lyra climb into the cargo area and made sure she was secured before taking his own seat. As the shuttle lifted off from the surface, Kyle looked out the window at the destroyed colony below. New Portland would soon be nothing more than a memory and a mark on a star chart. But Lyra and Ember had survived, and that meant hope still existed somewhere in this dark universe. The girl still held that crystalline coin in her hand. Kyle wondered what she would do with it and why she had offered it to him in the first place. He had a feeling that coin meant something much more important than simple currency. It was a symbol of something deeper that he did not yet understand. The shuttle climbed higher and the colony disappeared from view. Kyle looked over at Lyra and saw that she had fallen asleep with Ember tucked against her chest. Both of them looked peaceful despite everything they had endured. He made a silent promise to himself that he would protect them no matter what came next. The transport ship waited in orbit above them. Kyle knew that getting Lyra and Ember aboard without authorization would be difficult, but he would find a way. That $5 coin she had offered represented a debt he intended to honor. Her people would be remembered and their story would be told. He just had to keep them alive long enough to do it.